Hi, my name's Andrew Francis, and recently when I was in India, my son-in-law asked me why it was that I don't believe that Christians should tithe. Before I go into the scriptural basis for this, I would like to take a moment to talk about my own background and how I grew up believing that tithing was an important part of the Christian walk. So even before I'd become a Christian, I'd understood tithing, which is giving 10% of my income to God, was a principle expected of God of all Christians. And I was disappointed that my parents, for instance, didn't tithe as a matter of course. On becoming a Christian, I certainly didn't want to evidence any half-heartedness in my faith, and so I tithed without question. And according to my understanding, and an understanding that's often taught, I tithed firstly towards my local church, and then I would give to other missions and needs on top of this. Because of my own struggle to receive any good thing from the Father, in the early years of my Christian walk, and as evidence of my holiness of life, or so I thought, I would give away 50% of my income to God's work. At the time, I'd either read or heard of interesting facts being promulgated by various teachers and preachers, suggesting that if we really sought to live in a biblical way, then tithing was only the starting point, and that in reality we should give up to 30% of our income, because that's probably what the Israelites would give to God when you not only added their tithes, but also the sacrifices are expected to be given on behalf of sin at the various festivals that they were to take part in, Thanksgiving sacrifices and the like. So if we really wanted to live a life filled with faith and experience all the blessings of God, then that was what was needed. And one of the preachers that I listened to testified to the great blessings that he'd received as a result of his giving. I also read of another family who managed to give away 90% of their income and live on just 10%. Their book was full of wonderful testimonies of God's provision and faithfulness. And of course, this to me became the target. I didn't want to be some pew-sitting, lukewarm Christian. I wanted to be one walking in the favour of God. I wanted to be an example to others of true Christian life, and hopefully through my giving to bring conviction to their cold hearts regarding their love of money. And so whilst I never was fully convinced of the claims of some in the faith movement, and I was never convinced of the prosperity emphasis that was often promulgated, I'd been too much influenced by people such as St. Francis of Assisi and various other wonderful saints throughout history who had chosen lives of simplicity and sacrifice. Nonetheless, because of my openness to the teachings of much that was doing the rounds in the Pentecostal and charismatic movements, I felt that there was at least some validity in what was being taught. And so at some level I felt a little bit confused. My biggest problem, however, was, as I alluded to previously, my own sense of guilt that I felt if I kept anything for myself. And so on one hand, I gave because I genuinely wanted to serve the Lord and to see his kingdom extended. On the other hand, if I didn't give, I'd feel guilty about it. Sadly, I believe that many teachings that I have heard and continue to hear confirm this. They play into people's sense of shame and guilt. And for me, I concluded that this was evidence of the conviction of the Spirit. When I went overseas to Argentina at age 21, I went there on a short-term mission trip, and I decided not to tithe for the time I was there. I decided to do this because much of the money raised had already been set aside out of my own income and had been given for me to do the work of God. I remember one Sunday on visiting a large Pentecostal church with a newly converted friend, and I was told off by a Spanish woman sitting near me because we didn't put any money in the plate. It was explained to us, and my friend obviously had to translate for me so that I could understand this, that if we didn't tithe, we would be under a curse. In my time in Argentina, often I would find myself running out of money without any food except for pasta and tomato sauce, along with the constant difficulty of being poor. On returning to Australia, I later discovered that there'd been extra money sent through to me which just had never made it. And so later, as I reflected on my experiences, I began to wonder whether my lack was due to my inability to trust God's provision evidenced by my decision not to tithe. Was I indeed experiencing the outcome of my failure to give as many believed is taught plainly in Scripture? On my arrival back in Australia and subsequently throughout married life, my wife and I have tithed without fail, even when it meant that we could not afford to purchase our own home. Not only have we tithed, but we have also sought to support missionaries and children through the work of World Vision in their sponsorship scheme. I've taught others to do the same. I've made special point in sermons when preaching through books such as Haggai and Malachi, just as the people of Israel failed to receive God's blessing due to putting their own home's construction over the construction of the temple, so too surely we're going to be missing out on God's blessing if we failed in our giving to the church. Likewise, I made special point of emphasising how we rob God, as I preached through Malachi, when we failed to give our full tithe into the temple. I would emphasise that this is our job to give to the church, whether we agree with how the money is being used or not. After all, it is God's money once it's been given. And so in all sincerity, I would encourage others to do as I would do, and more to the point, as I believe the Scriptures was clearly pointing out. Influences at the time included Peter Wagner in his book Churchquake, and he dedicates a whole chapter to tithing, pointing out that it's one of the distinctions that's clearly seen in growing churches. So surely if God was blessing churches and individuals who tithed, and the evidence seemed to be very clear that he was, then on top of all of the above, who was someone like me to question it? And yet, I would often find an internal sense of discomfort regarding preaching too vigorously or even at all on the issue of giving. I was also aware that I would choose not to take money to large Christian gatherings or conferences because I didn't want to have to struggle through some laboured guilt-inducing talk on the importance of giving to a particular ministry. I remember at a large Christian rock concert at an artist whose integrity I can't fault, he had a friend of his, a pastor, get up to give the offering talk, and it was one of the most manipulative offering talks I've ever heard. Everything within me wanted to jump up in the crowd of thousands and challenge him on what he was saying. His concluding prayer only made matters worse as he attempted to involve God in his efforts to part people with their finances. Of course, I didn't have the courage to say anything publicly, and so I just seethed internally. A number of years back, my son Aaron, who was all of 12 at the time, just returned from a youth camp run by a large contemporary church. The camp had been paid for by the fees charged, as far as we understood. But Aaron explained that at every session there was a lengthy offering talk given. I was outraged, as I felt that this was verging on abuse. Aaron calmly explained that he and his friends had stopped taking money ages ago, as in their opinion the church had enough Xboxes and PlayStations already. He just recently watched the film Luther, and it was based on Martin Luther's life, and he concluded, "Dad, to me, it's just like indulgences. They're offering blessings for money." And it was one of those moments of fatherly pride in the spiritual wisdom of my fast-growing son. When I came to Perth, to my first parish that I was to be in charge of, still very much under the influence of Peter Wagner et al., I encouraged people to share their testimonies of how they'd been blessed in their tithing, hoping this would encourage others to do the same. For the life of me, however, I continued to feel an inner resistance to preaching on this topic. I was then given a book that argued against tithing and looked at the inequity of it. I.e., this is a reality. A person who has a large income can tithe quite happily and not feel any sacrifice or any cost in what he's doing. Whereas a single parent or a pensioner or a poor person, when they give 10% of their money, it may have an enormous impact on how they live, how they eat, where they live. The book also argued that tithing was only introduced in the 6th century and that there's no evidence that it was something that was practiced in the New Testament or by the New Testament church. And whilst the book was well argued, still somehow there seemed to be something missing, and I wasn't entirely convinced of its conclusions. Nonetheless, my misgivings continued to grow. I preached through the Gospel of Mark to my congregation, and when I came to Mark chapter 12, verses 13 to 17, and in particular verse 17 stood out to me, Jesus said, "Give to Caesar what belongs to him, but everything that belongs to God must be given to God. And I felt like the Lord say to me, Andrew, just wait on me, I want to talk to you about this. Don't read your usual commentaries that you read, because I would often read through a commentary or two to try and get a sense of the context of the passage, to hear the different interpretations of the passage, and so forth. But on this occasion, God said, don't do this. I want to talk to you about this. Now, interestingly enough, even after I prepared my sermon and preached on it, I read 2 commentaries on the passage, and they actually agreed with everything that I felt that God had spoken to me about. But God used this passage to help me to properly question the whole issue of tithing. To question what is God's, and so what anyway? What does it mean? What does it look like? How do we apply this as Christians today? And so in the next few teachings, that's exactly what I would like to do. At this point, I'm just going to leave you here. I've explained my story, where I've come from, my journey. Maybe you relate to some of my journey, maybe you won't. But hopefully what I'll teach you will help set you free from some of the teaching that is presently going on throughout the body of Christ in this nation and many nations of the world. God bless.